let me start. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to come to this 37th EAF seminar. As usual, we have many old faces here, but let me introduce first Minister Gong Do-myung, the chairman of East Asia Foundation. He's former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Okay. Then let me introduce Professor John Larry, who teaches at Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University. He's a Yale graduate and China expert. Speaks fluent Chinese.
Better than my career.
I really appreciate your taking time out today, just a few days before your third child's due dates.
Yeah, wow.
Just
one of my last activities.
Yes. So,
public activity.
all right. Thank you very much, John. And then I will take that round. Mr. Nick Hansen is one of experts delegation invited by Foreign Ministry, and he worked as a analyst of North Korean activities for a long time. Right now he's affiliated with Stanford. Yeah. And Ed Dong is Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at U.S. Embassy here. And I heard that you will leave soon, right?
Yes.
Returning to the U.S.
Be forced to leave.
Okay. Then Minister Shin On, he worked as a former minister at New York Consulate General. And then your
my name is Dong-Min Lee from Dankook University.
Dankook University. Okay. Your name?
My name is Kurzi Stender. I'm from Friedrich Ebert Foundation.
Ebert Foundation. Okay. And then let me introduce Charge d'Affaires, Royal Norwegian Embassy, Mr. Jun Hetland. Then Professor at INHA.
Yes, University Riga. PhD law professor.
Yes. And?
I'm assistant of Mr. Richter, Friedrich Naumann Foundation.
Okay. And then you're from DPA, the German press agency, Mr. Golder. Yeah. And
Jennifer Chang, the Press TV Seoul correspondent. Press TV is Iran's English language global TV news channel.
Okay. Then Chairman Jin Young Kim. Yeah. Right now. ABC. Yeah, ABC. Then Dan Kingston at International Crisis Manager Group. And then our the Deputy Consul General at San Francisco.
Yes, Korean Consulate in San Francisco. I traveled with these learning devices.
And then let me introduce Ethan Epstein, who is associate editor of Weekly Standard. Weekly Standard. Then from here, our two East Asia Foundation interns, and okay. Then
My name is Young Sik. I'm
yes. And two of you. Okay. Then our ladies from Foreign Ministry today.
I'm Minister from the American Museum from Mofa.
Yeah. And
Stacey Lee, I'm escorting this group of gentlemen invited by the Foreign Ministry.
yeah, Simon Mundi, Finance Times, and Dong. Yeah, and three ladies are interns at East Asia Foundation. All right. So, John, you start by introducing Professor Gold. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hong, and welcome everyone. We always have a high-powered, dynamic group here, and we're lucky to have Tom Gold. Tom is a very good friend, so it's hard for me to give a formal introduction. In fact, I just had to whisper to him, what is your title again? So he's a professor of sociology at University of California, Berkeley. He also, another hat that he wears that many people in the China field, basically everyone in the China field knows Tom, likes Tom, and is indebted to Tom. That is very much universally the case. And another reason that everyone knows him and is indebted to him is he's executive director of the IUP, Inter-University Program, which is run out of Tsinghua University, one of the best universities in China, and is a fantastic language program, Chinese language program. So every generation of Chinese studies, particularly Americans, large proportion of those will go through IUP. If Dr. Hong's exaggeration of my Chinese has any truth to it, it's because I did IUP as well 10 years ago plus. So anyway, Tom also runs IUP. His first trip to China was in 1975, and he's been at the forefront of U.S.-China relations ever since then, and has incredible stories to tell on that side. His first trip to North Korea would have been in 2009, which happened to be my first trip as well. We went together, and I'm sure he'll talk about that on an interesting tour. So, Tom, I think, had interest about North Korea predating that, but probably since that trip they've grown even stronger, and I think he's formalized some of that interest a little more and started writing about and talking about North Korea, given his very long, deep background on China. So that sort of sets us up for his talk today. How close are lips and teeth? Thinking about Sino-North Korean relations. So we've asked Tom to talk for 25-30 minutes, and then maybe I'll have a couple questions, but obviously we'll open it up to the floor, so all of your questions will be welcome once he's finished. So Tom, without further ado.
Thanks. Thank you very much, John. And Dr. Hong, it's really a pleasure and extremely intimidating. I was intimidated before I entered the room, and now that I've heard the identifications of everybody around the room, this is even more intimidating. The Chinese have an expression, banmen nongfu, which means to wield an axe at the gate of Lu Ban, who was a famous carpenter. And it's basically showing off your limited skills when you know you're going to be humiliated. And so that's sort of how I'm approaching this talk today. As John said, North Korea has not really been the focus of my research. And that's when I was asked to give this talk. I included the phrase "thinking about," so that this is really a number of ill-formed ideas that I hope can stimulate discussion. Now, for those of us of a certain age, when we think about China and we think about North Korea, we think very, very much in a Cold War mentality framework. And the Chinese, I'm not sure who coined the phrase, but certainly the Chinese used the phrase quite a bit, that relations between the PRC and the DPRK are as close as that of lips and teeth, that they have shared weal and woe, in particular their experience in the Korean War, that they also shared occupation and brutal treatment by the Japanese, that they were close comrades during the Cold War, that Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong saved each other and had quite a bit in common in terms of their political philosophy, their attitude towards society, as well as personality cults which developed around each of them. Both of them advocated an idea of uninterrupted revolution that is necessary to continue to revolutionize society in order to achieve socialism and then communism. Both North Korea and China see of themselves as divided countries, divided because of American imperialism, and kept apart because of American imperialism. So in spite of a long history of conflict and invasion, there's this strong bond, this other bond that brought China and North Korea together as close as lips and teeth. Now, John mentioned the trip that we took together in 2009 to North Korea, and we were part of a first group of Americans. It was billed as a study tour, a first group of Americans to go. Previously to that, there were scattered Americans who went, but Koryo tours and these sorts of groups would not accept American passport holders on their trip. And both of us are China people, and so even though John lives here, so that we had different kinds of expectations when we went to North Korea. And one of the things that I had expected to see was a great deal of positive propaganda or positive displays of support and affection towards the Chinese, that they really were going to reciprocate this idea of lips and teeth. But one of the things that was so surprising to me was how in evidence China was. I had to keep asking about going to Panmunjom. I said, well, weren't the Chinese here too? Where did the Chinese sit at the table? And other places about, well, weren't the Chinese involved in this as well? I had to draw out from the North Korean hosts the fact that the Chinese had also been so deeply involved in so much of the creation and the continued existence of North Korea. So one of the things that also the visit to North Korea brought home to me, having been to China for so many years now, was how their paths have diverged so much. So the people we met had these ideas about authoritarianism or dictatorship or totalitarianism, but these are ideal types in the Weberian sense. That these are abstractions that are used for analytical purposes, but in real life, the details can often diverge quite a bit. And one of the things that I think is really important in thinking about China and North Korea, that they're both one-party dictatorships. They both were led for many years by charismatic leaders, and they both advocated self-reliance, juche, as an economic policy. Both divided countries in the Cold War, all of these kinds of things. But nonetheless, there is quite a bit of distinction between the two countries. Also, one other thing that was quite critical is I was going to write an autobiography about my time in China, and I was going to call it Self-Disabuse. And the idea was that thinking about China from the American perspective, growing up in the United States, the first time I went to China or was working with Chinese, actually as an interpreter for Chinese delegations coming to the U.S., I had all of these very naive ideas about what China was like. And I had been very much influenced by Cultural Revolution propaganda. Having gone to college in the U.S. during the 1960s, all of the upheavals at that time, China really presented a very attractive model. And so when I first actually met real Chinese, as opposed to people from Taiwan, which is where I had studied language and taught and so on, I was really expecting them to be these paragons, these embodiments of all of these kinds of values that I had learned about from the propaganda. But it was really living in China as a student from 1979 to 1980 that I was able to break through all of those preconceptions and realize that the reality of China was quite different from the propagandistic presentation of China through the party and state media. The point being to emphasize that North Korea, I assume, like China, operates on at least two levels. You have the official party-state propaganda level. You have the structure of the political system, the relation between the party must lead everything, the role of the military and so on. But at the same time, you have society where life is lived on a daily basis by the masses, which to a certain degree is going to be shaped by this structure and this propaganda. It's going to constrain a lot of what people can do. But one of the things that was brought home to me so clearly living in China was the way that so many people's lives go on in spite of that. And what a lot of people do is spend much of their time figuring out how to get around the rules, how to get around party control. And so that when we think about, again, these ideas of totalitarianism or dictatorship, That's at one level, but at another level, the societies may operate quite differently. So this idea of self-disabuse is that I'd learned to disabuse myself of a lot of these naive notions that I had about what society in China was like and how the people of China unquestioningly supported the regime because that's the way that it had been presented. I mean, from the perspective of 2015, this seems ridiculous and naive. But at the point in the 1960s and the 1970s, it was not so strange. It actually made quite a bit of sense. And if you challenge that, you risk being ostracized by much more politically correct people. And I think it's really important for us to learn much more about how North Korea operates on a daily level, the way that now so many of us know how China operates on a daily level. And this, I think, is also important. I'm very struck by the number of people from Germany or representing German institutions here. Because just before lunch, we were at the Ministry of Unification, where we talked a fair amount about Germany. And I just happened to have spent 2 weeks in Berlin at the American Academy in Berlin, in Wannsee. And it was really interesting there also seeing so much of the legacy of the Cold War, or the lack of interest or the lack of knowledge about the Cold War. So many things that were so important to those of us growing up at a particular time now have become kitsch, or they have become something people don't want to talk about. It's not an important thing. So all of these ideas about what societies are like, the relation between state and society and so on, I think are really critical. And they also, the fact that they change so quickly, and the China case has changed so dramatically. John mentioned my first trip to China was actually in 1975, which was at the end of the Cultural Revolution. Mao was still alive, the Gang of Four was still in power, and there was the personality cult was still very active, and Chinese were very reticent about having any kind of interactions with foreigners. They were worried about being tainted by their close contact with foreigners. I had worked as an interpreter for Chinese delegations in the United States since 1974. And one of the things was striking there was when you talked to Chinese, when you asked a question, like what's your favorite song, or what's your favorite food, or something, they all gave the same answer. It was all a uniform answer. Again, from those of you, so many people who have a lot of experience in China, you sort of can't believe this now. And it's the way with North Korea, too. If you ask people, when John and I, in 2009, John tried to use some Korean to talk to people on the street, and that was the problem. Your Korean was possibly the problem. It had nothing to do with that. I'm sure it's a lot better now, but that they were still very nervous about having anything to do with foreigners. So I guess one of the points I keep trying to make is the difference between the way society operates, what people are really thinking, and what the propaganda is. Because then when I went back to China in 1979. As a student, I went to Shanghai as a student in February 1979, which was right after the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, which now means ancient history to most people. But at that time, boy, that was the critical turning point in Communist Party policy, shifting the focus of work away from political struggles over what is socialism to achieving the four modernizations. And it was quite clear at that time that whatever rules the Communist Party had tried to establish after 1949, even though they had been attacked during the Cultural Revolution, were no longer held. But nobody knew what the new rules were going to be. From a perspective of a sociologist, this was really interesting, because this is the whole idea of the institutions, is that you, not in the formal organizational sense, but in the sense that representing relatively stable stable clusters of norms, values, behaviors, and expectations that define behavior in particular social realms. It was so clear that in China now, everything in 1979, everything was up for grabs. And this provided a tremendous window, again, for me to be able to see what people really thought, how they really interacted, their thinking about their government, the party, the United States, Taiwan, and the rest of the world. So the theme that I've been developing so far is just this necessity of thinking that there's more to life than what we get from the propaganda machine. One of the things that struck me about North Korea in 2009 compared to China in 1975 was that Pyongyang, at least, was more colorful. There was more diversity. It just seemed that there was even though there was nothing in the stores, and you got the sense that the whole thing was a stage set, it nonetheless was a more lively, colorful stage performance than China in 1979. So I don't speak Korean. I've taught myself the alphabet, but not much more. But one of the things I kept wondering the whole time was, what are people really thinking? And to what degree are people's dreams and hopes being suppressed? And if, as in China in 1979, the government, or the current government or successor government decides to change all the rules without telling people what they are, how will people behave? What will they turn to as any sort of values or standards to govern their behavior? So all of this experience in North Korea, of course, got me thinking more about China and going back and forth. So that, one of the things that my takeaways from the 2009 trip was that relations between China and North Korea were more estranged than I had expected. I had expected this much more sense of closeness, of lips and teeth, but in fact, they were there was quite a bit of divergence. Two examples. Certainly, one important example of divergence is that China has full diplomatic relations with the Republic of Korea. That trade and investment relations, tourism relations, all of these kinds of things that China has with South Korea have a major impact on how North Korea views them, and as much, I think, a sense of betrayal as anything else. Xi Jinping visited South Korea, not North Korea. President Park Geun-hye has visited China. Kim Jong-un has not visited China, even though has apparently wanted an invitation to go there. Anyway, so all of these. And also that China has joined in moves at the United Nations and with other countries in condemning the nuclearization and condemning the missile attacks and so on, so that if their relations were really as close as lips and teeth, you wouldn't expect the Chinese to side with all of these other actors. And again, just one final thing: when our plane from Pyongyang landed at Shenyang, everybody on the plane spontaneously applauded, which I think was really an important sign of when you go to China and you feel free at last. You really know that you've come from a very different place. Okay, so the main point, I guess, that I want to emphasize next is that North Korea, I don't think, is a high priority item for China anymore. I don't think it's a high priority item. I think one reason being that China is possibly overextended in many ways, both domestically and externally. And that China's main goal for North Korea is to keep quiet and not make trouble. Even though the Chinese would like North Korea not to cause trouble, but at the same time, the Chinese believe that North Korea can be used as a bargaining chip against the United States, against South Korea, against Japan, should it be necessary. So the Chinese think that they can sort of turn it on and turn it off, that they can get both keep North Korea quiet most of the time so that they can proceed with many of their own activities, but also to if necessary, to let it act on its own, and then the Chinese can come in and show that they actually do have some influence there, so that foreign powers have to keep having to turn to China to deal with North Korea. So that let me see. I think when we so what I want to do next is to look at what some of these ways in which I think that China is overextended domestically and internationally, and how this influences relations between China and North Korea. So Xi Jinping has been the General Secretary of the Communist Party for almost 3 years, and then next year he will mark his third year as President of China and as Chairman of the Central Military Affairs Commission. And he has been extremely aggressive in consolidating his power in his own hands. That he holds these three top positions in the party, the state, and the military. And at the same time, he has also been moving quite aggressively to eliminate all real and potential opposition that he might find within the party and in the political system. So, of course, one thing is he's been carrying on this anti-corruption program. It's very popular, our understanding is, among the masses. But at the same time, of course, it's stirring up a lot of enmity and fear within much of the leadership. So he got these two, he talks about attacking tigers and flies, that the rule of law is paramount, that nobody is too big to escape the rule of law if they're engaging in corrupt activities. So the two biggest tigers that he got so far are Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang. And it's not just a question of these individuals, but it appears that he's also pulling the skeins of all of the networks in which these people have been involved. The news this morning was that they've arrested Ling Jihua, who was one of the bagmen for Hu Jintao, right? But so that there's all of these different. Some of these big fish continued to fall, even though it looked like for a while he was softening on the anti-corruption move. So a lot of sacred cows, a lot of things, people thinking themselves being immune, no longer are necessarily immune. There's also rumors that he might be going next after Jiang Zemin, who was his predecessor but one, and that there were stories circulating last week that Jiang Zemin and the Shanghai gang that he is sort of the head of might have been responsible for the stock market manipulations as a way of trying to weaken Xi Jinping's position. Xi Jinping not only holds these three formal positions, he's also created a lot of small groups and appointed himself the leader of these small groups. So this is the most, at least it appears to be not just on the surface, but this one man has consolidated more power in his hands through all of the different sectors of Chinese society than anybody since Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping really only held one formal position at the end, which was chairman of the Chinese Bridge Society. Not like a bridge across the Han River, but a bridge playing cards. Of course, there really is corruption within China, but Xi Jinping, even though he talks about nobody being immune in the rule of law, it's quite clear that the anti-corruption campaign is quite selective. But nonetheless, our understanding is that a great number of people within the Chinese bureaucracy, the Chinese political system, are quite terrified of being attacked, of being approached, of being drawn out and given prison sentences. And so that there could be a backlash in that instead of people coming and surrendering or turning in other people for their corrupt activities, that they could be banding together to confront and possibly overthrow Xi Jinping. There have been rumors that there have been assassination attempts on him, and that it's clear that he's also trying to garner support in other aspects, in other areas of Chinese society. So one thing is going after corrupt officials, which, as I say, has a lot of political support. But another thing that he's been engaged in, especially over the last couple of weeks, is this crackdown on dissent. And so that there was, when we went to, you weren't there, but when we went, I don't know if you did it on the trip you just did to China, visit this Tong Lihua law firm. It was a law firm that took on the cases of migrant workers and laborers and so on. And it was one of these, the Chinese for a number of years had celebrated the emerging role of civil society, and how there were these human rights, rights protection lawyers. And there were also various NGOs which were rising to supplement the work of the Communist Party. But Xi Jinping is cracking down on all of this, seems to feel that all of these are conspiracies to subvert the legitimacy and power of the Communist Party, and that they're all being run secretly by governments and international NGOs abroad. So that there's all this paranoia within, not only within the party and the state, but also within civil society about all of these kinds of crackdowns that are going on. In the last couple of weeks, there have been this roundup of 100 and some lawyers who were known as human rights lawyers, accusing them of hooliganism and disrupting social order. Some women who were involved in civil society activity on behalf of women's rights were also arrested, though they've subsequently been released. But there have been, so that domestically, moving on the party, moving on society, there's also a lot of activity as regards the minority populations in China, especially in Xinjiang and in Tibet. There was a story last week of a Tibetan monk who had been in prison for quite a while who died, and the Chinese cremated his remains and would not turn them over to his relatives, and so it was another way of sort of alienating the Tibetans. Ongoing criticism and ongoing suppression of minorities in Xinjiang, so that you have domestically these various kinds of challenges. One from the minorities who do appear definitely to be restive, but also on the Chinese periphery, there are activities which are of great concern to the Xi leadership. So that March a year ago, you had the sunflower movement in Taiwan, where you had the occupation of the legislative yuan by hundreds of students who were opposing the Kuomintang, the ruling party's, what they called it, black box or midnight agreement, attempt to passage agreement on economic relations with China. And it's not that people necessarily oppose regularizing economic ties with China, though many do. But the thing was that this was another example that, in the minds of many, that the leadership in Taiwan was preparing to sell Taiwan out to the communists, and so that they were demonstrating against that. And this really demonstrates the great amount of concern in Taiwan with closer relations with China. So that's one aspect of what was going on in Taiwan that was scary to sort of on the Chinese periphery of concern to Xi Jinping. But another, of course, is coming up next January. There will be a presidential election in Taiwan, and it appears the smart money at this stage is on the DPP, the opposition party's candidate, being elected to the presidency. And so Beijing is also very nervous about what this might imply about more concerted moves towards independence or increased autonomy on the part of Taiwan. When the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, was in power from 2000 to 2008, there was an unprecedented move towards increased de facto independence, let's call it that, certainly increased autonomy. And Beijing's reaction was extremely tough, and it served to alienate the people in Taiwan even more, that they really showed how much they do not understand what drives Taiwan society. So that they're very nervous now about how to respond should the opposition come back to power, even though they've claimed that they're changing their attitude towards dealing with China. So that on the periphery you've got that problem. Then another problem that is of concern to the regime is in Hong Kong, because last fall in Hong Kong you had several weeks worth of demonstrations by young people ostensibly over political issues, about how the next chief executive was going to be nominated and elected in 2017. But as in Taiwan, it represented a much deeper strain of unhappiness within society in terms of the way relations between China and the peripheries are developing. Within China also, there's just an unprecedented number of protests. Nobody really knows how many protests there are, what the definition of a protest is. But just last week or so, there were big demonstrations in Shanghai against a petrochemical plant. And so the environmental issue is another potentially incendiary issue. And then just finally, in terms of domestic issues that influence the power of Xi Jinping and his ability to deal with the outside world, is this question of the China dream. This is his mantra. This is his contribution to communist theory, even though it's not the least bit communist. But the idea is that individuals in China have their own dreams, and that the Communist Party now is creating an environment where everyone can achieve their own dream. And at the same time, China itself has a dream of national rejuvenation. That since the middle of the 19th century, when China was weak and was invaded by foreign powers, China has been humiliated, known as the sick man of Asia. But now China has come back, even though there's a certain amount of unfinished business. So that what Xi Jinping is doing is leading the people of China to realize their individual dreams, and at the same time to realize China's national dreams. That there's no contradiction. It's a harmonious relationship between achieving your individual dream and achieving the return of China's greatness. So that all in all, the reason I've been going through all of these domestic things is to try to indicate that there's a great deal there's a great deal of potential for instability within the Chinese leadership, both because of these purges at the top and increasing unrest and disruption within China and also in the borderlands. Now, turning externally to what is shaping Sino-North Korean relations, I think we cannot talk about these in isolation from the larger geopolitical context in terms of China's relations and strategies in the region and beyond. Quite clearly, China wants to be a player. They want to be taken into consideration. They want to be consulted on pretty much all issues of the day. That they don't want, whether it's international organizations or great powers, to think that they can make decisions about international issues without consulting China as well. So that China's activities then, both regionally and internationally, have been both constructive and provocative. Part of it is to achieve the China dream, and part of the China dream is being taken seriously by other powers, but also the fact that this process of achieving the China dream is disruptive and challenging to many of the taken for granted things about how international relations work. So what are some of the things that the Chinese have been doing as shaping part of the larger context in which relations with North Korea exist? One is this One Belt, One Road policy, where the Chinese, they had for a number of years this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was based in Shanghai, but it was trying to build economic relations with some of the countries of Central Asia. But now they really have a very clear strategy, or increasingly clear strategy, for rebuilding the Silk Road from Beijing all the way across into Europe. Who was that? I think somebody we met yesterday made the important point that Xi Jinping recently went up to Manchuria, to Dongbei, the three provinces in the north, to reassure them that they were important to him as well. So for all the talk of the new Silk Road, which does not involve Manchuria, which of course is on the North Korean border, don't worry, we haven't forgotten you, and that we're also going to continue to invest and develop the Northeast as well. So you've got the One Belt, One Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which the United States opposed and tried to get our allies and other countries not to support because we saw this as disruptive of the global financial system which the United States had set up, led by the World Bank and the IMF after the end of World War II. But nonetheless, virtually every country, in any case, went and has signed on to that. You've got the RCEP, which the Chinese are developing in contrast to the TPP, which is the United States is pushing as a free trade, as a trade area, which does not include China. And then the Chinese are also very active in way outside of their region. So that the Chinese were in Vienna last week in terms of the Iranian negotiations. The Chinese have sent a mediator to Syria, so that they really want to be players on the. So this is their constructive approach, and some of these, so that they can be seen as really assisting in helping the developing world. But from another perspective, this can also be seen as disrupting the world order, which had been built by the United States. But on the other hand, a lot of the Chinese activity outside of China is seen as dangerous and provocative. So I haven't got time. Everybody, I'm sure, is familiar. I don't have to go into it. But the activities in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, constant provocations against India, and so on and so forth. What we've seen now is that, so for a while, it looked almost as if China was having a free ride in pushing the China dream throughout the region and beyond. But lately there's been a great deal of pushback. In the East China Sea and the South China Sea, a number of countries say we don't want to use the word China in referring to these bodies of water. We don't want, that seems to indicate that we grant China legitimacy over them. But there's been pushback from Myanmar, pushback from Sri Lanka, of course Vietnam, the Philippines, there's been, and then Taiwan and Hong Kong, there have been demonstrations in Africa and in the South Pacific. So the Chinese, what looked like a free ride for a number of years, is no longer there. The U.S. pivot needs to be seen. Of course, there's a lot of questions about how much this is really proceeding, but also has to be seen as setting the context for relations between China and North Korea. U.S.-China relations seem to be going in the toilet. They seem to be on a downward trend, and because John recently was in China with a group from the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'd really like to hear what you picked up in the sense. But certainly from the U.S., it appears that this is going on constantly on a downward trend, and that there's no real voice to try to turn the situation around. Xi Jinping is scheduled to visit the United States in September, but there have already been calls to cancel the visit. And even if he comes, what issues are going to be on the agenda? Is North Korea nuclear denuclearization an issue they're going to discuss? What about all these issues about NGOs, about civil society, about arresting of the lawyers, about dissent, about all these other things that I've been talking about, the rule of law and so on? Are those issues that the United States feels that we have a right to raise with China, or the Chinese just going to say that's none of your business? So from the United States perspective, China is being very disruptive of world order, and it's not clear whether there's real support, real groundswell in Washington now to talk to the Chinese about any of these issues. About any of these issues. Does the PRC really have a grand strategy? And if they do, what role does North Korea play in it? It seems that Xi Jinping is acting, all these things I went through, acting as if he's extremely strong, extremely confident. But I think from another perspective, it can be seen that he's very nervous and that he's very weak. He's not going after every tiger. There's a great deal of pushback both domestically and internationally. He makes one big mistake, and he can really be in trouble. So that if he does go to Washington, if Mr. Xi does go to Washington and he comes back with egg on his face, that he can't spin that story, that could have a major, serious impact on his position at home, losing control. So that one other thing is that the Chinese, for a number of years, have been, when Kim Jong-il was still alive, trying to present the Chinese model as a model for North Korea, to show that you can open up, you can have foreign investment, you can have marketization, you can have students going abroad, you can have foreigners coming to teach, but the party will not lose control. Look at us, look at what a good job we're doing of improving the standard of living of our people, of dealing with social change, but at the same time the party isn't threatened. But one of the reasons I've gone through so many of these things is to indicate that there are a lot of points where the party really could be threatened. And that if Xi Jinping, through this trip to the United States or through some error somewhere else, really has this whole thing blow up in his face, that could really have a serious impact on him, on China's relations with the outside world, and including North Korea. So then finally, the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II is coming up, as also commemorating the establishment of the Korean Workers' Party. Invitations have been sent openly and surreptitiously through all of the different parties in different venues. So I think one thing we have to pay attention to is who's going to show up and who's not going to show up at these various events, and what this is going to tell us about China's position vis-a-vis North Korea, vis-a-vis the United States, and vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So I went much longer than I thought, but let me stop with that and look forward to your comments and questions.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tom. You gave us a lot of food for thought. I heard sort of two halves to the